I spent the last several weeks protesting property taxes, helping homeowners, and honestly, I've barely had time to look up. But while I was away, the economy did not sit still. The Federal Reserve made its decision. Mortgage rates stayed stubbornly high. The conflict in Iran entered another chapter. Artificial intelligence went from being the hottest technology story in the world to one of the most controversial, and Texas keeps finding itself right in the middle of all of this. So today, we're catching up, not on every headline, but on the stories that actually matter. I'm Kyle Grimshaw, and this is the Texas Market Brief. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Kyle Grimshaw with the Grimshaw Home Group. Today is Friday, August 14th, 2026. It's been a little while since our last episode, not because I forgot about the show, but because I've been out in the field helping homeowners protest their property taxes. And spending that much time with homeowners gives you a very clear view of what people are feeling right now. Higher costs, tighter budgets, more caution, and a lot more questions about whether the economy is actually improving or just changing shape again. So today, instead of pretending nothing happened, I want to catch everyone up because quite a bit has changed over the last few weeks. Let's jump on it. The last episode we published ended with one big question. What would the Federal Reserve do? Well, now we know. At the end of July, the Federal Reserve voted to leave its benchmark interest rate unchanged at 3.5% to 3.75%. That marked another meeting where the Fed chose patience over action. But the bigger detail is this: the decision was not unanimous. Three policymakers dissented and preferred another quarter point hike. So, yes, rates stayed the same, but the internal conversation clearly became more divided. And I think that matters because when the Fed holds steady, a lot of people assume mortgage rates should immediately fall. That did not happen. Mortgage rates are still sitting in the mid to upper sixes. As of August 13th, Freddie Mac said the average 30-year fixed mortgage was 6.67 and the 15-year fixed was 5.96. That tells us something important. The housing market is not waiting on one Fed meeting. It is reacting to the broader economy. Inflation, energy, treasury yields, risk, expectations, that distinction matters because if you misunderstand that, you misunderstand why borrowing still feels so expensive. This is probably the biggest misconception in real estate. People assume the Federal Reserve controls mortgage rates. It doesn't. The Fed controls short-term interest rates. Mortgage rates are driven much more by the bond market and by what investors believe inflation is going to do over the next several years. If investors think inflation could stay elevated, mortgage rates tend to stay elevated too. That's why mortgage rates can rise, even when the Fed doesn't raise rates. And that's also why mortgage rates don't automatically fall just because the Fed pauses. Housing is not priced off today's headlines. It's financed off tomorrow's expectations. And right now, the market still is not convinced inflation has completely gone away. That's the real issue. Not whether the Fed moved once, but whether investors believe the inflation is truly over. Back in June, the question everyone asked was, will there be a war? Today, the question feels different. How long will the instability last? The conflict hasn't completely ended. It has evolved. We've seen military strikes, ceasefires, diplomatic talks, new attacks on shipping, and repeated uncertainty about the Strait of Hormuz. And that matters because that narrow shipping lane still carries an enormous share of the world's oil. So every time the markets start worrying about disruption, oil reacts. And when oil reacts, inflation risk comes right back to the conversation. Now let's bring this back to Texas. Higher oil prices can benefit parts of the Texas economy. Energy producers, pipeline operators, oil field services, LNG exporters, but for the average family, higher energy prices usually mean something much simpler. More expensive gasoline, higher transportation costs, and eventually higher prices across the economy. That is why this story matters. Not because it's happening halfway around the world, but because global instability has a way of showing up in your monthly budget. And when people ask why inflation still feels sticky, this is one of the reasons. Just a few months ago, everyone wanted to talk about what artificial intelligence could do. Now, people are asking a different question. How much AI do we actually want? You've probably heard a phrase over the last several weeks, AI slop. That's become shorthand for low quality AI generated content flooding the internet. Fake articles, fake images, fake videos, spammed comments, mass produced noise that often adds volume without adding any value. And I think that is fascinating because it tells us the technology is maturing in real time. The conversation is no longer just what can AI do? Now it's how do we use it responsibly? And that conversation is not just happening online, it's happening physically too. In communities, in power markets, in infrastructure planning. Reuters reported that lenders are scrutinizing data center financing more closely as local opposition grows. And here in Texas, Governor Greg Abbott took a much more aggressive step. He ordered a pause on approvals for new data center projects seeking connection to the ERCOT grid until regulators can audit issues like power use, water use, tax break, ownership, and local impact. That is a major shift because it suggests Texas is still open for an investment, but no longer interested in giving blank checks to everyone who shows up with an AI pitch deck. And honestly, that feels like a more mature conversation. Texas wants the investment, but Texas also wants to protect Texans. That means asking who pays for the power, who pays for the water, who pays for the roads, and whether the upside stays local or just the costs do. That is a much more serious conversation than simply saying yes or no to artificial intelligence. Over the last several weeks and months, I've spent a lot of time sitting across the table from homeowners. And one thing became very clear. Most people do not actually understand how the property tax protest process works. They assume the county already has all the information. It doesn't. They assume the appraisal district has seen the actual condition of their home. Oftentimes, it hasn't. They assume protesting isn't worth the effort. Sometimes it absolutely is. One of the biggest lessons from this year is that preparation matters. Not preparation H, just preparation matters. Comparable sales matter, photographs matter, documentations matter, and understanding your local market matters. A protest is not about gaming the system. It is about making sure the system is using accurate information. And whether your protest is successful or not, every homeowner should at least understand how their property is being valued. Because if you do not understand the system, it becomes very difficult to challenge it. And right now, in a state where affordability is still one of the biggest issues people are dealing with, that matters. One thing became very clear while I was away. None of these stories exist by themselves. Interest rates affect housing. Housing affects affordability. Energy prices affect inflation. Inflation affects the Federal Reserve, and artificial intelligence affects electricity. Electricity affects taxes, and all of it eventually affects your monthly budget. That's why I started this show, not to chase headlines, but to connect the dots. Because the more you understand how these systems work together, the better decisions you'll make. Whether you're buying a home, building a business, planning your investments, or simply trying to take better care of your family. And that's really the lesson from this last few weeks. The economy did not pause just because some of us got busy. It kept moving. And if you are not paying attention to how these stories connect, it gets very easy to feel like everything is happening randomly. It isn't random, it's connected. And once you see the connection, you start making better decisions. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Over the last month, what has been the biggest economic change you've noticed in your own life? Has it been housing, interest rates, artificial intelligence, energy prices, your job, or something else entirely? Leave a comment below and tell me why. I read every single one. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe And if you know someone who enjoys understanding how business, politics, real estate, technology, and economics all connect, share this episode with them. I'm Kyle Grimshaw with the Grimshaw Home Group. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Texas Market Brief. I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and remember, the best decisions are made by the people who understand where the world is headed.